I'm Kevin, otherwise known as Forum BX257, here to bring you another 1980s G.I. Joe tour review. And for this second Navy theme month, I'll be taking a look at the Cobra Underwater Elite Trooper, the 1988 Hydro Vipers, sometimes known as the Demons of the Deep. Now, the Hydro Vipers don't make any cartoon appearances, but they make their first comic book appearance in the Old Marvel comic run of G.I. Joe in issue number 81. Where they're not shown in their full and very distinctive outfit, unfortunately. As a matter of fact, on that subject, the Hydro Vipers are actually quite a memorable figure, although they're so bizarre in a way that a lot of people who remember them actually don't remember them being part of the G.I. Joe line.
First, we'll take a look at the Hydro Vipers accessories. Taking a look at his dagger. Very interesting lightning bolt shape. Also take a look at his harpoon gun. Now, as you just saw, I had the harpoon gun kind of attached to the bottom, this bottom knob here. I don't think it's actually supposed to go there, but the trigger actually fits in there really well. And, well, to be honest, the figure doesn't actually have a second hand in order to hold the second accessory, but I'll get into that a bit later. Next, he comes with a Regulator Mask. Just unplug these standard G.I. Joe hoses. The mask isn't a complete helmet, and it does fit on his head very oddly. You kind of have to angle it on there before placing it on, or else it just kind of sits on a funny angle. Of course, he comes with two of these standard hoses, which fit onto his scuba backpack. They have pegs for the hoses just right on the top there. The standard hoses, which are about 3 inches long, are kind of awkward to get from the backpack to his mask. So there are several ways you can do it. I just had them wrapped under his arms like this, but you can just have them wrapped around like that, but they kind of stick out quite a bit from the side. So that's why I have it wrapped underneath there, just so he has kind of a lower profile with the hoses don't snag onto anything else. And last but not least, he comes with a pair of what the contents list on the card calls fathom fins. Basically swim fins or flippers. They're a really rubbery material, and they look very organic, demon-like in fact, with that strange leathery texture. And speaking of strange leathery textures, he also comes with a devil ray. It's a type of manta ray with a barbed tail. It's actually a very good representation too. A lot of tiny details like the little fins at the back, and just the way the eyes sort of bug out like that. And now to discuss the Hydro Viper's most distinctive feature, his left hand. It's a non-usable left hand, unfortunately, but it's webbed. A lot of collectors actually remember the webbed hand on this action figure when they don't even remember that the Hydro Viper was part of the G.I. Joe series. It's just that memorable. And while it may seem odd for them to do that, it actually goes very well with the rest of the details on the figure, which I'll discuss in just a bit. But it also goes with the explanation that this guy is surgically and maybe even genetically modified. It's clearly distinguished on the file card, and while it may seem a bit far-fetched for Hasbro to do that, you do have to remember that that is something that Hasbro had actually done with Cobra before. The Strato Viper from 1986 was modified just for high altitude, and let's face it, Serpentor was a clone, so that's really where all this sort of stuff comes from. As a matter of fact, some people have even said that the modification of this figure might have actually been inspired by Mara from the Sunbow G.I. Joe cartoons, who was modified to the point where she couldn't actually leave the water. And while the webbed hands is very, well, just sort of creepy and monstrous, there are all sorts of other little cues on him as well. Like this bit over his face, which almost looks like a Regulator Mask just by itself, has kind of an odd opening, kind of like a puffer fish or something, or catfish. Then he has these little leathery bits all over him, as well as on his feet here, which I believe are really supposed to be an extension of the flippers. So that's a nice bit of continuity of the sculpt there. Because again, sometimes the people who did the sculpt for the accessories were not necessarily the same people who did the sculpt for the figure itself. So I always count it as really nice when that sort of thing flows very well together. Obviously he has his rather non-practical looking mask. This is really where he gets that sort of Demon of the Deep nickname, I'm assuming. And of course, it's also very interesting that he even comes with a pet manta ray on top of that. Something that, to me, always seemed a bit less like Cobra and more like another organization, which I'll get to in a bit. And speaking of in a bit, one very interesting thing is the symbol on his arm here is not a Cobra symbol. I thought it might be like a stylized Cobra symbol or something, but to me it just looks so much more like, I don't know, like a beetle or something. Which has led a lot of people to think that the design for the Hydro Viper might not have started out as a Cobra figure at all. Like the 1988 Iron Grenadiers Nullifier pilot, a lot of collectors believe that the Hydro Viper started off life as a recycled Cobra Law design. A lot of that organic look on him translates very well to the other two, and the color scheme also matches very well with these other two Cobra Law figures. I suppose by 1988 Hasbro wanted a new Cobra Underwater Trooper, but you have to admit that the 1985 Cobra Eels are probably the most memorable for that role. Even though the Hydro Viper is actually quite memorable just because of how he looks. On top of that, the Hydro Viper of course has a different name. They could have simply called the Hydro Viper a new version of the Eels, but they didn't. And on top of that, he is actually listed as the Elite Trooper. So one would think that these guys would just be like the standard Navy, whereas these guys would be kind of the Navy SEALs of the group. Now, I know a lot of collectors really dismiss the Hydro Viper because of his looks, and even though his looks are kind of explained on his file card as being part of his genetic and synthetic modification, you do still have to realize that, well, look at what came before. A very technological looking frogman, and even guys like the Strato Viper and the Star Viper, who are modified as well, do not look like the creature from the Black Lagoon because of it, whereas this guy does. But I think that part of his look is actually psychological, basically psychological warfare. You do have to remember that the sea is something that's filled with the unknown, and because of that, a lot of sailors become a little bit superstitious. So can you imagine something like this guy popping out of the blue, or seeing this guy for the first time, and him shooting his harpoon gun at you? That would be scary. And that's the point. As far as who a rival would be for the Hydro Viper, it's actually easy to say that any of the G.I. Joe sailors would actually been able to fight against this guy. But if you want an example of a scuba diver, you would have, of course, guys like the 1986 Wetsuit, who is admittedly a little bit old for this guy. But just the following year, after the Hydro Viper's release, we do have a new version of Deep Six, who is admittedly not a scuba diver, but a deep sea diver. But still, you can still see these guys fighting against each other, where the eels might fear to tread. The Hydro Viper would, of course, be able to go far down deeper to where Deep Six would be able to go. There are a couple of things that I kind of wish they had done with the figure. One of them is, well, mostly his chest. As you can see in the original card artwork, that chest would have actually been black. And they just sort of skipped that paint app, which, I mean, granted, with all these accessories on him, he looks great. But without them, he's just that plain sort of purple color, and it looks kind of washed out and kind of, well, boring without it. I think that black vest would have really made the figure kind of pop, even without the accessories. Another very interesting thing about the card art is that it actually shows storage for his harpoon gun on his leg. Like, the harpoon gun is specifically behind that very circular piece on his leg, which is right there. There is no peg and there is no way of attaching the harpoon gun onto his leg. As a matter of fact, I don't think you would want to, because the way it would have attached, it would have actually had gone past his foot. So he wouldn't have actually been able to stand up straight if he had the harpoon gun attached to his foot anyway. I think the Hydro Viper makes a very interesting army builder, because even though I have said that he looks a little bit plain without all of his accessories, and if you're army building him, you're probably getting a few of these guys without, you know, a complete accessory list, he still does look very good with a lot of the later Cobra aquatic vehicles and playsets. In the same year that Hydro Viper was released, we also have the 1988 Battle Barge. And he is actually shown on the Battle Barge package, and he does look very good in it. His red actually does match very well with the dark red that the Battle Barge has here. And of course, I have two other Cobra figures which have that distinctive purple outfit as well. So that's not just something that the Cobra Law figures have. The regular Cobra figures actually did have that same sort of coloring as well. And then, of course, we have most collectors' favorite pairing of the Hydro Viper and a vehicle, the 1987 Sea Ray. Of course, he fits right on the bottom there. And again, because it's a peg system, you can't actually put his scuba tanks on him. But he looks great on there nonetheless. And of course, this vehicle is yet another one which is home to a figure, the Sea Slug, who has, again, the same type of purple. While the Battle Barge and the Sea Ray are really good choices for pairing up the Hydro Viper with, personally, I think their somewhat grayish color scheme might actually go a little bit better with the 1985 Eels than it does with the Hydro Viper. So this is actually my pick for what to put the Hydro Viper on. It's the 1986 Hydro Sled. Very appropriate name. And at least here we have tons of room for his Devil Ray and his extra accessories. And of course, he can keep his scuba tanks on while using it. If you're looking for a Hydro Viper on the aftermarket, you shouldn't have to pay all that much because he is a fairly well-produced figure. He isn't particularly popular. Even as an army builder, most people still build more of the Eels than they do of this guy. And on top of that, his accessories, while there are quite a lot of them, making it fairly hard to find a complete Hydro Viper, they're still actually very sturdy accessories, and the figure itself is a fairly sturdy figure too. You would think that with the pegs and with the tiny little tail on the Devil Ray, things like that would snap off, but no, they're all fairly robust, and this guy is fairly easy to find on the aftermarket.
Now, Hydro Vipers make their first
really replace the eels so much as they actually, as far as food is.
Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind-the-scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then.